Welcome back. I'm really interested in this because I think it does highlight the debate. I really wondered if South Africa, if we fast, take 2015, and if in February the 2nd, 2015, the clerk, rather older than he was in 1990, but if he still had been the leader and we had waddled on for 25 more years of apartheid rule, and on the 2nd of February 2015 he had announced that he was now going to discuss matters with the ANC, to take that hypothesis, I really seriously wonder, with the same balance of forces as they were in 1990, whether in fact any kind of criminalization could ever have occurred, i.e., wouldn't the army and all the people who could have been charged said, you must be nuts, we're going to carry on fighting? And in a way, isn't that what, Mugabe, the last thing he wants is the possibility that he can be hauled in front of an international criminal court for all sorts of charges, which presumably would be leveled against him.
No, I mean, South Africa is lucky because the transition occurred before the ICC. So in that sense...
But I'm probing the politics of it, the reality.
No, the politics of it are okay, because what you're saying is that there is a political process of reconciliation. There are actors who are trying to forgive themselves institutionally, creating mechanisms that say, we are not going to repeat these crimes again. And I think that's the South African model, that there's a transition process that comes up and sets up mechanisms that potentially are not going to return this country to that kind of apartheid-like context. In most of our African countries, what we find is that we procrastinate on building institutions for justice, for reconciliation, and so on. So we keep repeating the same mistakes. And the ICC has to come in and say, there needs to be order. I mean, in this context where impunity becomes the order of the day.
But if you're an ordinary African, anywhere in Africa, but perhaps in some of the hot spots which have been spoken about on this program, I mean, what confidence do you have that an African court, once instituted and running properly, is going to do the job?
Courts are the last mechanisms for resolving what are essentially political problems. And in Africa, we face that issue that we have governance problems that allow leaders to stay in power for more than 30 years. We have leaders who stay in power and they abuse their people. The legal mechanisms are only scrambled because we have a legacy, we have a culture of impunity.
But that means that actually, if you follow that argument, then in fact, actually these courts are almost irrelevant, because if you've got as a substructure a governance which allows people to be in power for 35 years or longer and couldn't care a damn about democratic principles in a grand scheme of things, then you get to a position that it's a political problem. And if it's a political problem, why would people who've manipulated the politics be prepared to be susceptible to a jurisdiction by a court?
No, absolutely. I agree entirely that the problem is political. If one looks at the Constitutive Act of the African Union, for instance, it has got very good clauses, wonderful clauses, on human rights, on democracy, on the sanctity of life, and so on. But when you look at the practice of the African Union through its leaders, nothing could be further from, a departure from what the Constitutive Act says. So it's really an issue of the politics in Africa, that there is need for there to be a paradigm shift now, that the politics needs to serve the people. And that's really the biggest challenge we have in Africa, that leaders are there for the people, to serve the people, and not there for their own purposes. And when they
so without proper politics, I mean, the kind of debate we're having about the ICC versus an African court almost is irrelevant then.
Yes, it is irrelevant, and especially the amendments that are being made or that were proposed in Malabo, where now they're giving immunity to heads of state and other senior government officials. In the first place, those who commit international crimes are those in power, who can use armed forces, who can support rebel groups or finance rebel groups or lead rebel groups. So international crimes by their very nature are committed by those who are at the top of the of the power structures. An ordinary person is unlikely to commit an international crime.
Sorry, let me ask you this then. What should we do now? And let me try to kind of tell you where I'm going. I was particularly prompted. I've been interested in this issue for a long time, but I was particularly prompted to have this program. I listened to a radio program on one of the national radio stations which was talking about this issue. And I was quite shocked by how many people said, you know, Mugabe's got a good point and who's the ICC, etc., etc. So I kind of wondered, where does this leave us? I mean, if we have to start with the basis that leaders who perpetrate crimes against humanity should be held accountable, what do we do?
Well, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So here we have a court that has been proposed. There is legislative frameworks as to how the court is going to work.
This is the
African court, this is. There is an opportunity to work on this court protocol before the court opens its doors. There are many things that can be worked on between now and then.
And how do we prevent people like Mugabe from so influencing it that it'll actually be honoured only in the breach rather than the compliance?
I think we should be more focused on trying to see how we can strengthen the court as it is right now, and not focus on personalities. Be very clear on the legal provisions of this protocol and see whether indeed it would be possible to investigate and prosecute the crimes, the 15 crimes that this court is going to have jurisdiction over. When we are able to ensure that the organs of this court will function well, that there is financing for this institution, then we can then be happy and say that, look, the victims of these crimes will get an avenue of getting redress.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree. There has been momentum within Africa actually to deal with impunity, and as you're mentioning, the Constitutive Act of the African Union very clearly says we are not going to entertain impunity. So there has been a gradual process of building the norms, the institutions around it. If this court can do it, well and good. And I think
well,
maybe
do you think it can? That's what people are going to be asking.
You know, the ICC is a good creature because it's a sword that is hanging over us. And when it hangs over us, then it also forces us to begin to do other creative things. So over the long run, we should not give up on what Africans are doing. And
I mean, on that follows, presumably, the South African government and the South African people should be supporting the initiative.
Absolutely. And you find that right across Africa, especially on those situations that are before the ICC, the victims of these crimes, or at least the families, the surviving families of the victims, those who've been killed, are supportive of the court.
Who speaks for them? I mean, I only hear the voice of Mugabe et al. I don't hear that voice.
Again, that's a very important point, and that's the role now of civil society in Africa, that civil society has an important role to play, and not to give up, because, you know, human rights is like taking a bath. You do it every day and you don't give up. You know, it's something that we just have to keep at it.
Well, it's a very appropriate moment to close, because let's start with what's common cause. It's common cause that crimes against humanity are ones that we should be desperately concerned about, that those who perpetrate them should be held accountable. The real question is, who's going to hold them accountable, particularly on our continent where they do occur, wherever happens elsewhere in the world. And the question is whether the ICC should do that, its criticisms about it notwithstanding. And should we then have an African solution through strengthening the international court, the African court, which is about to start? Can we have its resources? Can it be independent enough? Can it do the job? But perhaps the really more important point is this: unless we all care about our commitment to human rights and holding leaders accountable for atrocious crimes that have been committed, and actually try to promote the interests of victims, nothing will happen. How do we do that? Judge for yourself. Goodbye.